Welcome to TrustTalk. What happens to global trade when trust between nations begins to erode? Today's guest has spent decades answering that question, not from the sidelines, but right at the heart of the action. Simon Evenett is professor of Geopolitics and Strategy at IMD, the International Institute for Management Development in Switzerland. He's a world-renowned economist and a sharp observer of the geopolitical forces shaping our economies. Simon has advised governments, guided business leaders around the globe, and co-chairs the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Trade and Investment. He joins us to talk about trade not just as numbers on a spreadsheet, but as a system built on cooperation, credibility, and trust. Your host, Severin DeWitt.
Simon, glad to have you as our guest. Before we get into the current geopolitical frictions, let's take a step back. Why do we need rules in international trade to begin with, and what shaped the thinking behind those early rules?
Cross-border international trade is riskier than domestic trade, which is typically between parties who know each other. As a result, conventions have developed over time, going back to the Babylonian kings, where essentially expectations have been developed about how parties behave during international commerce. The goal always is to increase predictability and to reduce uncertainty.
Let's go even further back. Economists have been thinking about trade for centuries. What role did Adam Smith and other early trade economists play in shaping how we view trade today?
Adam Smith and David Ricardo made important contributions in discrediting what was then the prevailing mantra about international trade. That mantra said that countries win when they have trade surpluses because they acquire gold from other countries. That mantra, by the way, is not very different from the position taken by the President of the United States at the moment. What Adam Smith and David Ricardo showed was that countries can gain from trade without any trade surpluses or trade deficits being created, and that the basis for mutually beneficial trade relies on differences across economies which are arbitraged to the benefit of both parties.
Some might reduce trade to numbers, prices, tariffs, contracts. But in your experience, how central is trust to making international trade function? Can a global trade system work at all without it?
No, a global trading system requires some degree of trust. Even if one writes extensive rules concerning different aspects of either state behavior or firm behavior, those rule books will always be incomplete. And so there will always be ways around the rules. And in order to dispel the impression that someone might engage in malfeasance, one needs to have a reputation for good behavior, which is, of course, a supportive factor of trust. So trust helps fill in the incomplete rulebook that we have about international trade.
At its core, is international trade a tool for cooperation between nations, or has it become more of a weapon of strategic competition?
The short answer is it's been both. Until the most recent years, it has been a form of cooperation and a source of mutually advantageous growth. However, in the recent years, we have seen governments restrict exports of certain technologies and raw materials with the goal of trying to advance their foreign policy and national security interests. And so as a result, trade has become, in that sense, a weapon. So we have seen an evolution towards greater use of trade as a weapon and less use of it as a collaborative instrument, although that's still there in large measure.
But even with trade as a weapon, or let's say in competition, there are supposed to be rules. Doesn't the whole system start to break down when trust in those rules fades?
The system does take a big hit when trust is diminished in the existing rulebook. But I should add the very types of weaponization of trade that I talked about, especially through restricting exports, is an area where the WTO rulebook is actually at its weakest. The WTO rulebook is strongest when it comes to measures to restrict imports and weakest when it comes to measures to restrict exports. So interestingly, the rules gap has been there all the time. It's just that there has been widespread restraint, and of course that restraint has supported the trust that you asked about.
You just mentioned the WTO. How has the global trade architecture like the WTO held up in this area of rising protectionism and unilateralism? Are these institutions still capable of maintaining trust among nations?
So the World Trade Organization has not had an easy decade or so, especially since the global financial crisis. It has lost its ability to adjudicate disputes. It has lost a lot of credibility as a negotiating forum and as a place to monitor and discuss what governments are doing and to find solutions. It hasn't had a happy time either. All of this is to say that governments have not sought to use this valuable institution well. And so in that sense, one should not blame the institution per se, since it was created by governments. And if those governments don't want to use this institution, then the onus should be back on them as to how else they're going to rebuild trade. And at the moment, beyond signing regional trade agreements or free trade agreements, we don't see much evidence of a system-wide attempt to restore trust.
During the Trump administration, the US threw out many of the trade rules that had shaped the global economy for decades. Tariffs were used not to correct unfair practices, but to punish countries, sometimes even allies, for running a trade surplus. How much damage did that do to the trust between countries?
The America First trade policies are undermining a huge amount of trust in the system, or perhaps even just simply undermining trust in the United States as a reliable trading partner, as well as a reliable shepherd for the system. It had a much smaller economy decided to undertake the policies the United States is taking now, I think there would be much less worry or concern about this. But the US helped build this system and sustain it, and unfortunately their current behavior is leading many to wonder whether or not it's still committed to a rules-based trading system. Now, to be fair to the Americans, they have not left the World Trade Organization. They have not indicated any desire to leave the World Trade Organization, as they have left other organizations like the World Health Organization. So we have a very, at best, intermediate position from Washington, where they're not out of the camp, but they're not fully into it either. And I think this is a situation which is hopefully going to be resolved, ideally, with re-engagement by the United States, as they see that the uncertainty that is generated by the America First policies is counterproductive, not least for the United States, or especially for the United States.
Turning to the business side of trade, how do global companies manage trust across complex supply chains, especially in a world shaken by geopolitical uncertainty?
So whenever you have a sourcing or a selling relationship, the length of time of that relationship and the willingness to collaborate over time can provide very strong incentives to sustain trust and collaborative behavior. And I think that is still an option which is on the table, no matter what the trade policies are. So I think incentives can be supplied either contractually over the short term or reputationally over the longer term. And that premium on being known as a reliable supplier and a reliable payer on time, these things will go up over time as we see more policy-based uncertainty. And so I think we will see a greater emphasis on trusted partners in international trade, with firms positioning themselves as either being trusted or coming from geographies which can be trusted. And so in that sense, your theme of trust will arise, I think, as a competitive advantage for some firms which seek to differentiate themselves from others.
Simon, we see more political problems around the world, wars, sanctions and tensions between countries. How do these issues affect the trust that businesses need to trade across borders? At what point do companies start to pull back and trade only within their own region, if that's even possible, given how complex global supply chains have become?
So the answer to that question will very much depend on the line of business. As you hinted at in your final clause there, There may be some lines of business where cross-regional sourcing is absolutely essential. For example, there are not many countries which have known copper deposits, and many of them may not be in the region where a firm is currently based. So some degree of cross-regional engagement, I think, will be sustained. The other side of this coin is that, of course, as the level of policy uncertainty, potentials for policy reversals grow, then companies will be reluctant to deploy capital in jurisdictions or in supplying jurisdictions where there is so much uncertainty. And so some degree of retrenchment is quite likely. To the extent that there's more policy stability within regions, and of course in the European region, we can clearly see the beneficial role of the single market in helping to stabilize expectations, then you might see greater pressures towards regionalization. But if you have a region where one of the big players is out of control and engaging in far-reaching policy changes, then you may well see other countries in that region trading more with the outside world. So it's quite possible that Canada will intensify its export diversification initiatives. It's quite possible that Mexico will choose to do so should their neighbor continue to behave in a manner which undermines trust and cross-border engagement.
With all these disruptions, tariffs, disinformation, and what we just mentioned, the geopolitical rifts, what steps can be taken to rebuild trust in the global trade? Are we talking about new policies or new institutions or something different?
I would separate the policies from the institutions. And essentially, policies reflect choices of governments, and governments must have a fundamental objective to put a priority on stability. If they do, then they will choose to stabilize their policies, and then they will find other like-minded countries to essentially either create or restore institutions which lock in certain trade policy behavior. So I think it all comes down to what is it that governments value? What do they see as being the way in which trade can offer the most for the development of their country? And if they think that trade contributes most when trade policy is stable, then they will find other countries which share that conviction and then find ways to codify through institutions or international agreements that type of behavior. Now, some will say, well, look, we already have that at the World Trade Organization. It's a matter of refinding the spirit to bring that organization alive. I would have no problem with that line of argument. I suspect, however, in the near term, we will see other types of initiatives which maybe do not include all of the WTO membership, but include coalitions of the willing who are looking for what I might call oases of stability of policy.
So looking back at your career and everything you have seen, do you feel hopeful that global trade can move back towards more cooperation and trust? Or are we seeing a permanent move away from working together through multilateral agreements?
I see quite a lot of differentiation across geographies or jurisdictions in this. There's clearly a group of countries that even if they don't particularly appreciate liberalized trade, they want stabilized trade policies. And that group of countries will find a basis to cooperate going forward. Whether that group of countries gets bigger going forward as other countries see the value or rediscover the value of stability is an open question. There may well be some jurisdictions who feel that they are so big, their economies are so big, that they can dictate terms to others as to how those others should behave. And those bigger jurisdictions may decide that they don't want to join in any collaborative arrangement. I would say to those bigger jurisdictions that the last 6 to 12 months has been very salutary in demonstrating that not even the big players have all the cards. And so I think essentially we will see differentiation. The temptation of policymakers in larger economies to try and go their own way will always be there. Some will succumb to it, but when those initiatives have been demonstrated to be sufficiently ineffective, then those policymakers may rediscover the merits of stability and collaboration. But that's a journey, and that journey may well take a number of years for some policymakers to figure out where the landing zone is, which delivers trade, which advances development within a country rather than destroys commercial relationships.
Trust is weakening not just in trade. The US is considering taxing money that flows out of the country, like dividends or profits, if the receiving country is seen as having what Trump calls an unfair tax system. Some call this capital protectionism. If cross-border investment is treated this way, doesn't it risk undermining the trust that trade agreements depend on? Can we really separate trade and investment when both rely on stable, predictable rules?
We shouldn't separate out the different sources of supply. What you're really describing is two ways in which overseas markets can be supplied, either through goods or being shipped across borders, or through factories moving and production being done within a jurisdiction by a foreign firm. There are two other ways in which markets can be supplied to. Either the customers move or the suppliers move temporarily. That is human movement. All four of these modes of supply, as they're called, and I guess you could also add digital delivery as well, so you have a fifth. All of them benefit from stability, nurturing trust, and also from lower cross-border transaction costs and taxes of the type that you've described. So any move away from ease of cross-border shipment through any of these modes of supply is likely to be costly. And so the specific proposals that you've described, which are in the United States Congress at the moment, which could involve taxation of certain overseas assets in the United States, these are retrograde steps and will be things which will be watched very carefully. The United States has its own multinationals whose investments abroad run into trillions of dollars, who are earning trillions of dollars of profits abroad. And so the US is very exposed to retaliation here if they choose to go down this route. And again, it would be a very sharp reminder of the fact that we still do live in a globalized world and that everyone can disrupt almost everyone else's commerce and trade if they want to. Some players are clearly bigger than others, but the biggest players have a lot at stake. They have a lot of defensive interests, and it's not just simply a matter of imposing their views on everyone else. And once policymakers hopefully realize that they have both defensive as well as offensive interests, then the search for more collaborative solutions which restore the trust, which has been a central theme of your line of questioning, should be addressed again.
Let's hope so. Simon, my final question. If you had to give one piece of advice to the next generation of trade policymakers, what would it be?
My principal piece of advice to the next generation of trade policymakers, trade negotiators, and trade officials would be to understand the commercial basis of international trade more. I'm an economist by training, and almost by instinct, we simplify in order to clarify. That is, we choose ways of thinking about how businesses operate in order to highlight key factors which we think are central. But the practice of international trade and the practice of cross-border trading is often a lot more complex than what many trade policymakers will have learned at school or at university. And if they're going to do service to their country and also to the commercial interests who supply goods and services within a country, then they should spend a lot more time learning about how businesses actually undertake transactions, or what pain points they face, and what opportunities they see. I spend too much time with trade officials, also trade academics, whose knowledge of how business actually operates is fairly weak. And I sometimes wonder if some of the more simplistic notions we hear from policymakers reflects a lack of understanding of how the private sector seeks to take advantage of globalization to advance its interests. And of course, it cannot do that unless it's advancing the interests of the customers that it serves.
Simon, thank you very much for your insights and wishing you good luck with your further research and publications in this field. And thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to answer your questions. Very thought-provoking and reminding us, I think, of the core foundational issues, which is that these policies and institutions exist to support trustful relationships between commercial parties, and that that trust can be built and destroyed in many different ways.
True.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Trust Talk. We hope today's conversation inspired new insights into the transformative power of trust. At Trust Talk, we're committed to exploring trust's role in shaping a better world, one story at a time. If our mission resonates with you, we invite you to support us. Your donation, no matter the size, helps us continue these meaningful conversations. Visit us at trusttalk.co/donate to contribute and be part of this journey. Thank you for listening and being part of the Trust Talk community. We can't wait to have you join us again for the next episode.